turn my mic on. Okay, this is my first time doing this, so thanks for your patience. I'd like to call our council workshop special meeting to order. It's Tuesday, October 12th, 2021, 5:38 p.m. And we have a presentation by Patrick Rondinelli from DOLA on Tabor. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. And I'll go through this presentation for you guys, but it's very casual, okay? So don't hesitate. If you got questions as we're going through, if you want to dialogue on any piece of this, I'm happy to. I'm not one of those that say, hold your questions to the end, or at least in this format, not to do that. Tabor, I was just mentioning before that Tabor can be very complicated for people to understand because there's multi-levels and facets to Tabor. I'm going to focus primarily on the financial side of it. There are some other pieces, and I'll touch on those tonight. But this presentation is actually primarily done for finance people, so it gets a little heavy into some of the jargon. I will try to keep it more at what my background and level is, which is working more with elected officials. And I was a city manager for 13 years, so that's my background, right? So I'm not a finance person, but I really like finance. So I will try to keep it on our level with that. I'm also going to caution that while I may like to pretend I'm an attorney, I am not an attorney. Former city attorneys that I worked with, I used to drive them nuts all the time because I would question and argue with them in case law and everything along those lines. But I am not an attorney. So once again, there's a lot of interpretation that's on this coming from the state's constitution, of which Tabor is a part of, that I'm happy to express what I've been taught and what my understanding of the opinion is, but I will always suggest to you default to the opinion of the city attorney and also work with your staff, whether you're working with Drew or you're working with Kelly as your finance director. They're going to be the ones to get you the detailed questions or be able to offer you an opinion and give you direction on things that you need to with questions that will come up in the future, okay? Also, finally, if there is a question that comes up tonight that I cannot answer for whatever reason, no worries. I will write it down because we've got a finance team at DOLA who helped me with this, and I can always go back to them and get the specific answers for any questions that we may have from that time. So that's my precursor ahead of things. Once again, I think most of you guys may have known from when I did the Council 101 training, gosh, what was that? It was back in February, January, February, something like that. Yeah, a long time ago. So that quick rundown, Patrick Rondinelli, Southwest Regional Manager with DOLA. I live in Ouray. I cover the Four Corners area, so I cover Montrose County, Ouray, San Juan, San Miguel, Dolores, Montezuma, La Plata, Archuleta counties. As I said before, I was a city manager in Ouray for 13 years. That's been my background before I jumped over to DOLA when Ken Charles retired. Some of you know Ken because he's over in Dolores right now. What is he going on, like his 2.5 years of interim as that. But Ken was an incredible resource for me in my entire career when I was in Ouray. And still, I talk to Ken. I'm actually having breakfast with him tomorrow before heading back, and I talk to him every couple of weeks. He's a great resource with that. So I've tried to carry that, though, on with what he did and provided for me as a resource and provided my community and my city councils that I worked with. And so, once again, as I mentioned before, back in early part of this year when we did the other training or tonight, it's not just about tonight. You guys need something at all from the state of Colorado, I am your liaison. I am here in the field with you. Even though I'm a state employee, I naturally default to local government because that's where I grew up. That's what I know. That's what I believe in is local control. And so, but I'm here as a resource for all of you guys, whether it's Tabor, whether it's board training, whether it's recruitment of staff, and then obviously once all the audit issues are done for the city, we'll get into the grant and financial assistance side, which we're looking forward to because I know you guys have got some great ideas and thoughts out there. So All right, let's jump into Tabor. So Tabor, the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, that's basically what Tabor, well, that is what Tabor stands for. Tabor was voted into the state's constitution back in 1992. It was championed by a gentleman named Douglas Bruce. Mr. Bruce had made, I think it was 3 other attempts to get Tabor passed prior to it passing in 1992. The 3 previous versions had failed. But in 1992, the voters of the state of Colorado passed the Tabor, and it went into, as I mentioned before, the state's constitution. So this is above statute. This is embedded in the state's constitution. We could go on and talk the pros and cons of Tabor. I'll hit on some of those a little bit here during the presentation. There's some people feel some flaws with Tabor, but it's not something that you can easily change because it's in the Constitution. So keep that in mind. Tabor has 5 limits in regards to budget in Colorado. The quickest way that I always explain to people when you talk about Tabor, Tabor's intent was to prevent or limit the growth of government. When I say prevent, ideally, the idea was government should not be growing at all. Government serves a purpose, keep it at that level, a specific, very limited level, and not let it expand. My opinion, and I'll always say when something's my opinion, Tabor was a reaction to, we've all seen it. How many times have we seen in the news on headlines about governmental entities taking advantage of the public? You know, whether it's, you know, usually in, more often than not, in some illegal manner, you know, elected officials, appointed officials, it does not matter, a lot of those type of things. Tabor was kind of a reaction to some of that, of trying to really limit the spending and the growth of government. So it's not just on the spending, but it's the revenue that's coming in and how quickly government can grow with that. So this first piece here, and I need my glasses so I can read that, you know, like I said, Tabor affects debt that the city can take on. It impacts the city's mill levy. The main point, you're going to hear me talk about this a lot, is the fiscal year spending. You really have to do some calculation. Your staff has to do calculations every single year to calculate what Tabor allows the city to retain in the way of revenue, and also looking at your expenditures and what you have on the spending side. And that all goes into a lot of the work and preparatory exercises they do for your budget. So as your budget is presented to you, you haven't presented the budget yet, right, Drew? Tonight. Oh, tonight, see? That's great. So this draft budget that's being presented to you tonight, a lot of this, your staff have done a lot of work in preparation for this in regards to Tabor. And then property tax revenue. Once again, that's another level of Tabor. One piece that's not Tabor, though, that I'm going to talk about is this 5.5% property tax revenue limit. This is a statutory limitation on revenue that was passed by the state legislature. So it's not in the Constitution, it's in the Colorado Revised Statutes, but it kind of goes hand in hand with Tabor. And once again, I'm going to show some examples here in just a little bit where you have to evaluate Tabor, and you have to also look at that 5.5% property tax revenue limit. There's some other components with property tax that have come on. You may or may not be familiar with the term Gallagher. The Gallagher Amendment was something that was actually just repealed almost a year ago, last November. But that 5.5% property tax revenue limit was in conjunction with Gallagher and Tabor that was in there. And so you have these different components that are out there that can be very complex. Hopefully I'll help with that a little bit tonight. But once again, your finance staff, that is what they deal with. They're trying to make sure they go through all these things and look at all these limitations for you of what's there. So let's jump into Tabor a little bit. First part I'm going to talk about is the debt limit off of that list that was there. Tabor, give the article and section out of the state constitution in regards to Tabor, and then I'll read through this to explain it, and then I'll explain it a little bit. Except for refinancing district bonded debt at a lower interest rate or adding new employees to existing district pension plans, creation of any multiple fiscal year direct or indirect district debt or other financial obligation whatsoever without adequate present cash reserves pledged irrevocably and held for payments in all future fiscal years. All right, a lot of legal jargon right there on that one, and some finance jargon in regards to this. Let me first do a couple things. You're going to see the term district reference a lot in here. When Tabor is referencing districts, it's talking about governmental entities. So it's talking about the city of Cortez. It's not exclusive to Cortez Sanitation District, which is another governmental entity. It is talking about any governmental entity. So counties have to deal with this, municipalities and special districts all have to deal with Tabor, and school districts for that matter. So that's what it's talking about in regards to when you hear the term district in any of the reading about the official language of Tabor. This also talks about debt at a lower interest rate. So the city is allowed to take on debt, and we'll go a little bit more into that area here, but oftentimes, well, I shouldn't say oftentimes, depending on the type of debt that you're looking to take on, you may have to go to the voters to get approval to take on that debt. Refinancing of debt, you can do that as long as you're refinancing into a positive direction, so meaning lower interest rate as it's indicated here. You can't refinance in a way that you're going to take on a higher interest rate. You know, why would you want to take on a higher interest rate? Well, you may be doing it to refinance so you can get a higher cash back to help. You know, think about it at home. You may refinance your house, take out the mortgage on your home. You may choose, most people wouldn't, but you may choose to refinance at a slightly higher interest rate because you're going to get a larger amount of money out that you're going to put improvements in your house and you got a long-term thing like that. If you were trying to do a similar type of thing with the city, you would have to go to a vote of the people. You cannot do that. Tabor limits that. So debt, there's not a lot that we're going to be spending on with this, but I just wanted to highlight that point of anything that reduces the burden on the taxpayers, you're okay to do with Tabor. It's putting more burden on your citizens is where you have to get permission.
Patrick, I have a quick question on
Sure.
that. So let's say you're refinancing like a $10 million debt to a lower rate. Can there be additional spending as part of that as long as you stay under where you originally were?
Yes and no. You're going to want to get your opinion from your attorney in relationship to that because you want to be very careful with that. Generally, I would recommend if you even look like you might be taking on more projects with that lower financing, you want to make sure if it's in a reasonable number. Now, define reasonable, right? But if you're saying, hey, we're able to refinance this, by refinancing this, we're able to generate a little bit more revenue that helps us to do this other project or additional project, I'd be really cautious with that because it could be argued, and your citizens could argue, you're putting more burden on them because you're taking on something else. Now, let me give you another example, though, of a refinancing that you can easily do, and I'll use this as a live example with the city of Ouray. When I was still with the city of Ouray as the city manager, we redid the Hot Springs pool there. Part of our financing package to redo the Hot Springs pool is we did what's called a certificate of participation on City Hall. A COP is a tool that governmental entities use, and it's like a mortgage. You're refinancing a mortgage. Or what we did is we took a loan out, in essence, on City Hall. COPs are not like mortgage because they're only for governmental entities. Governmental entities are expected to be more stable and reliable. That's why there's a whole market regarding the COPs. Anyways, we established the COPs to raise the money to do the pool, okay? City Council about 3 years later, refinanced those COPs. So they didn't take on additional debt or generate additional money. They just refinanced at a lower interest rate, which changed their payment schedule. That was totally fine to do, because they reduced the interest rate, they reduced the payments that they were going to have to be making on the original financing for the program. So that's where you can do it. So once again, it was a step down, where if you were to say, hey, we want to refinance this, but with that extra savings, we're going to take on another project, you would want to get an opinion on it. I think you might be okay if it's a small project, but if it was like, we're going to build a whole new public works facility with that change, when you start to get in that bigger part, you're going to get some questions.
No, I was thinking more along the lines of whatever the original debt project is, like when you refinance it, then maybe you build some new infrastructure upgrades for that project in,
Right.
kind of something
So,
like that.
and this is just a hypothetical. Let's say you had some debt on this facility, this building, and you wanted to add additional solar components to it. And so you refinanced with that, and then you used that savings to put the additional solar on that. You could probably get away with that, okay? This debt limit does not really come in to play as often as you would think it would, especially in annual budgeting. It's more of a long-term piece that you're looking at, and it ties into, and this is mentioned in here, the multiple fiscal year, direct or indirect. It's regarding multi-year debt obligations. That's another thing that Tabor limits you. In general, Tabor will limit that you cannot take on multi-year debt obligations. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, you cannot do that unless, once again, you have a vote of the citizens that authorize you to do that. Those exceptions are very specific tools that are used. I mentioned COPs, the certificates of participation. That's a recognized tool that has been used as multi-year debt, but once again, it's very limited in its scope of what COPs can be used for. Another thing that you will often see is what's called a lease purchase agreement. More often than not, governmental entities will use this when they're purchasing equipment. You got to go out and buy a new grader. I don't know the last time you guys considered a new grader, but they're not cheap. I think the last time I saw, they're probably in the $400,000 range. Oftentimes what you can do is what's called a lease purchase agreement, and so maybe in essence you're financing that purchase at $400,000 over a 10-year period, but what you are doing and the way the contract is written with the leasing entity is you're leasing it for them, and then at the end of the 10 years they just give you the piece of equipment, but you can walk away at any time, and technically they can walk away from that lease at any time, and you get nothing out of it. So if you 4 years into a lease purchase agreement on a grader, and then for whatever reason, city council decides we don't want to pay that anymore, you walk away. You've lost those 4 years of payments on that, but you don't get the piece of equipment. You get no credit towards what you had previously paid on it because you were leasing that piece of equipment till you hit that term limit, and then the way companies a lot of times will work is then they give you the piece of equipment at that time. So that's kind of those ways that have been developed as a little bit of a workaround with Tabor. They haven't necessarily been challenged in court. They could be challenged, but I think even people who are on the side of really understanding what Tabor was and supporting the reasons that are there have recognized, when Tabor was originally passed, there were some things that weren't taken into consideration, and they found a working middle ground of truce area that was saying, okay, we'll let governmental entities do this, recognizing it's not a multi-year obligation that's been chosen without a vote of the citizens. Next one here is mill levy limit. Districts must have voter approval in advance for any mill levy above that of the prior year. So I'm sorry, I don't know, Kelly would be able to tell you what the city's mill levy is right now, but you have a mill levy, which is the number that's associated with the amount of property tax that is collected by the city, okay? You have a set number on that. You, as the city council, cannot take any action in a meeting to increase that mill levy. You would need to go to the voters, only the voters. So the simple way to think about this is any tax increase of any kind requires voter approval. Does not matter. Does not matter. Because sometimes you'll get people say, well, what about this? Or what if we're just doing like a tax increase for capital improvement? No, you can't without citizen approval. And that, once again, there's okay? This is one of my opinion things on this. There's pros and cons to Tabor. To me, this is a really important pro. I think it's put a lot of expectation on elected officials that you must be very good at making your argument to your citizens when you want a tax increase of any kind. And that's not easy to do. There are other states without Tabor, and you can see this in the paper often when you do some research or talk with other governmental entities. There are states where city councils have no type of limit. You guys could, in a meeting, somebody make a motion of, we want to increase our sales tax from 3 to 4%, or we want to increase our property tax mill levy from 13.5 to 14.5 because we need more revenue. It's done by a vote of the city council, and it goes into law, and it goes into impact. Tabor does not allow that. You have to go to an election for anything like that. And that's what this mill levy limit is basically saying. Now, you all can choose to reduce your mill levy, and you don't need a voter approval to do that. So once again, if you're dialing it down, you're free to do that. But if you're increasing in any way, you have to go to your citizens. And I'll talk a little bit more about elections here in a bit. Fiscal year spending limit. So as I mentioned before, you're going to hear the term fiscal year a lot here. All districts' expenditures and reserves increases except, okay, maximum annual percentage change of inflation plus local growth. So this is the first big limit that Tabor imposes on local government is you're not allowed to increase your revenues and your spending beyond the annual percentage change of inflation, and local growth. Now, what does that mean? So part of the process is you go back and you look at what your actual spending was in the previous year, and then you have a limit on how much you can increase your revenues and spending for the upcoming year. And it acknowledges, Tabor takes into account inflation, and it's calculated based on the Denver, Boulder, I can't remember all the cities they list now, but the general inflation rate that's considered for the state of Colorado, not your local necessarily inflation rate, but it does look at local growth. You do get the opportunity to look at what are some of the pieces that are occurring in your community, taking into consideration the type of revenues that you have coming in, not just from a tax standpoint, but your fees that you're collecting. Like if you're seeing growth, a community expands, maybe you do an annexation to bring in a new development, a neighborhood of 500 homes or 50 homes or 10 homes, whatever it may be. That is calculated into your allowable local growth because you've expanded your boundaries, you've now increased your tax base. Those are calculated into. So there's calculations that go into that.
Patrick, so what if there's negative local growth? So are they able to stay at that rate, or do they lose?
We're going to get to that a little bit down here the line. So
Okay.
That's a really good question. So assuming, and for the most part, we see consistent growth. Now it may be very limited, or there are years it does get stagnant. But then let's say we have a recession like in 2008, where all of a sudden there is a significant drop. I'm going to touch base a little bit on that a little bit here. There's a component with that that's called debrucing that adjusts. You may or may not have to adjust your mill levy amount that accounts for that. But in general, you're going to look at you can't grow too fast. That if you start to generate more revenues than the limitations that are on this, you have to refund that tax money. So once again, some would argue that that's an unfair burden on government. Let's shift a little bit and say you're in private industry. If your business, you own a business, you own for the sake of this building, you own a printing company of some type, an old newspaper printing company, and your revenues increase 10 or 15% annually, great. You get to keep growing. That's what you're trying to do with your business. Government, you can't do that. You can't say, great, we're generating all this great revenue because we've increased, you know, the assessed value of property has gone up, so our revenues from property taxation is going up. There's limits on capping on that. So I'm guessing, just like everywhere else, you guys have all seen some increased assessed values in your community here. I mean, housing is crazy, right? Right now, there's things that people are seeing today that haven't been seen in years. What's that going to do? There's going to be some limitations can be some limitations from Tabor on you in relationship to how quickly that's going, and you lose out on some of that growth because of Tabor.
Would that local growth, would that also be like if residential property was converted to commercial property? So that would be calculated as part of that as well?
That's all calculated into the property tax, correct. And your mill levy is associated with it. Another piece that's on here is reserves. Now, some communities had tried the idea or floated the idea of, okay, well, let me take a step back forward. You are required by Tabor that you're supposed to keep reserves. Now, Tabor doesn't really go into specifics of what acceptable reserves are, but you have emergency reserves. They're supposed to be there. So you are allowed to keep taxpayer money, not give it back to them, a certain amount of money for emergencies, right? General government practices will say anywhere from 3 to 6 months of operating reserves is what you should have. I know some communities, especially after the last year and a half, they keep almost a year's reserves, operating expense reserves. Other communities have less. You are supposed to have some type of reserves, because if you have a major emergency, you're going to need some cash to address that, right? One of the things you can't do, though, is, wow, we saw this big increase in our revenues, and we're just going to transfer all of that over to our reserves. You're going to be limited on what you can do that. Reserves are calculated into your total fiscal year spending. So, and that's one of the pieces that's mentioning here, except it says reserve increases except. You're allowed to, let's say you use some of your emergency reserves, or once again, these last 18 months, 19 months, what we've seen, something that's never been seen before, we have this ongoing long emergency. Generally, especially at the time of 1992, the idea of an emergency was a major flood, a major fire, earthquake, tornado, you know, those type of things, which are more of a temporary emergency, and then you're trying to rebuild, which takes rebuilding and recovery takes a period of time afterwards. You may need reserves for that. Nobody anticipated a major event that 18 months into it we're still dealing with, and we're considered still in that emergency situation. What does that do in regards to reserves? So people will adjust those reserves, though, but you have to be very cautious, once again, that it isn't portrayed of, well, we had all this extra revenue and we're just going to call it reserves and put it over here. Reserves are calculated into what you're doing, so you can put, you know, maybe you keep 3 months of reserves normally, and you say, hey, in these times we really want to bump that up to 4 or 5 or 6%. You can allocate some additional money there and put it into those calculations, and you're allowed to keep that, but you can't just blindly take additional money and put it there.
So is there a minimum and a maximum in terms of what Tabor says in terms of reserves, or is that just up to the municipalities?
Technically, Tabor says you should have 3 months of reserves, and as I mentioned before, good governmental practices will say a minimum of 3 months you should have in operating expenses. I will often see communities push more close towards 6 months. There are some, though, that I said will go for a year, but you know, once again, and I covered this like when I did the Council 101 training back in the year. In my opinion, one of the most important and privileged responsibilities that you have is being responsible for people's money, their tax dollars, right? Their hard-earned money that they're giving to their local government to provide services for them in the community that they love. You also manage their assets. The citizens of the city of Cortez own this building, right? It's no one other person out there that's out there, it's a citizen. So you're there to protect those things. You want to be very careful of what you do with that money. You want to be responsible and have these reserves, but you also don't want to have too much money that you're just sitting on and that quite frankly, your citizens could be utilizing and maximizing to their benefit with that. So you want to find that balance. You also want to look at that too in regards to when you're doing capital projects and capital spending. You know, if you desperately need to build a new public works facility to better serve your citizens, and you're saying, hey, we don't have the money, but you're sitting on 2 years of operating reserves there, are you really necessarily being responsible with that, where you could be applying that money to serve your citizens better, but still keep a reasonable reserve amount with there? So Tabor, like I said, says, Tabor, I shouldn't say that it's required. Tabor recommends three months. And you do have a responsibility to get yourself to 3 months. But I can't say that, you know, there isn't like this Tabor police show up and start knocking on City Hall that you don't have 3 months worth of reserves. Your Tabor police are your citizens, and they can hold you accountable.
Or is there just a
Recommended minimum. It's really, this is one of those areas that you've got to determine what's appropriate. You all as the body, the elected officials, need to make that determination, what's appropriate for your community.
Kelly, I'm curious then what we have. You know, do you know the months of reserve that we have roughly?
And you'll have it set up by different accounts too. You know, your general fund, you'll have a number for your general fund reserve, and you may not have the same, you know, time period for all your funds, but your enterprise fund should have a certain amount of reserve versus your general fund that would have a reserve with there.
All those funds should have some sort of.
Yeah, enterprise you have a little bit more flexibility with because you don't have some requirements. And once again, enterprise funds, and I'll touch base more on this, are not subject to Tabor to a point. General fund is your main thing, your main general governmental operational expenses that are there. Okay. There are some exceptions to fiscal year spending limits. Gifts, federal funds. So if you receive ARP funding in response to COVID, that is not limited by Tabor. Collections for another government. Sometimes, this is mainly seen by counties. You guys should be familiar, the county assessor. The county collects money for other governmental entities, be it a sanitation district, a water district, a fire district. The county will often collect those monies and then pass them through to that district. That does not count into the county's Tabor calculation. Pension contributions by employees and pension fund earnings. I mentioned that was in that debt piece before too. So the pension funds are not calculated into Tabor. That is an exception. I think the idea of that is ultimately that's your employees' money. That's not necessarily the government's money. That pension program goes towards your employees who are serving the citizens of your community. Reserve expenditures or transfers. So where that gets into some of the calculations is when those reserves are used, depending on the situation. And this actually was something that came up after the 2013 floods. So the 2013 floods that occurred on the Front Range up in Boulder County, Larimer County area, they were trying to, obviously they had major catastrophe, they were accessing their reserves, trying to spend their funds. They found out that there were some limitations by Tabor, unintended limitations on Tabor about access to emergency funds and how those expenditures would calculate into these calculations and limitations on expenditures and revenues for the community. And so there's been some adjustments to that. Once again, some of those gray areas where they started to say, okay, nobody anticipated this when Tabor was originally passed, but here's the reality of what we have and what's an agreed path that we could go on with that. Damage awards, property sales fall into that. Property sales fall into it because for the most part, especially if it's large tracts of property, you have to get voter approval to sell those pieces of property. And then conservation trust fund distributions. The city and all municipalities annually from DOLA receive conservation trust funds, and those are not calculated into Tabor. The The main part on this is federal funds are not calculated, but state funds can be calculated into this. And that's a big point when it comes to some of the grant programs, and something that I deal with when we do award grants to communities. I work with the staff in relationship to that, and some of our funding. So our major funding program, our major grant program, is the Energy and Mineral Assistance Impact Assistance Fund, the Energy Impact Fund. That fund comes from two different sources. It comes from state severance tax collected off the extraction industry, and then it also comes from federal mineral lease revenue that comes to the state. That federal mineral lease, even though it goes through one grant program, the Energy Impact Program, if it comes from the federal dollars, that's not calculated into your Tabor calculations, but if it is state dollars, it should be calculated into your Tabor calculations. And could, depending on the size of that award, trigger that you've hit a maximum amount that Tabor allows and your revenues exceed that amount, and then therefore you have to do a tax refund to your citizens. So you want to look at that. There's a process when we're doing grant programs that we work with you in relationship to that before and a grant is awarded. We don't want to go under contract and award you a grant and then find out after the fact that we've put you in a bad position. So we work with you in relationship to that, but be aware of that. And then I'm going to throw this term out there now, and I'm going to go into a little bit more. It's called debrucing, and that is a process where you go to the voters and ask the voters to approve removing some of the limitations of Tabor. Now, I'm going to go through all the limitations of Tabor as part of this presentation, but I will tell you the city of Cortez has debruced. You guys actually did that not too long after Tabor was passed. There was a large number of communities that did at that time, but there are still quite a few communities out there that have not debruced, or they didn't necessarily debruce all the limitations of Tabor. But once again, I'll talk about that a little bit more here. So communities that have debruced, they have some numbers that they don't have to put into those Tabor limitations that are out there. Okay, starting to get into a little bit more of the specific limitations and how we calculate these pieces here. So the Tabor property tax revenue limitation. So that's the first of three different property tax limits that are in Tabor. I'll first read what the statement says here. The maximum annual percentage change in each district's property tax revenue equals inflation in the prior calendar year plus annual local growth. Inflation is equal to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index for Denver, Aurora, Lakewood. Local growth net is equal to net percentage change in actual value of all real property from construction minus destruction and additions to and deletions from taxable real property. So the first part of that, the inflation rate, like I said, you can look at your revenue. You say, here was our revenue last year. What's the inflation rate? The state's inflation rate, 2%, 3%, whatever it may be, you're allowed to go up that first amount, right? And then you get to look at local growth, and that's where it is looking at the actual value. So it's based on assessed values that you get from the county. That'll look at the assessed values within the city of city of Cortez. You actually have an assessed value within the boundaries of the city, and you're allowed for that to grow to a point. Now, once again, this is the first of three different possible property tax limitations. So you're allowed that inflation rate, you're allowed the local growth rate, but that's only one of the three that we consider. And I'm going to talk about the other two here, and then I'm going to show you some examples where we look at the three different limitations. What Tabor states is you have to follow the more restrictive of the limitations. And those limitations can change year to year. It might be one section that's is the trigger that you hit the maximum on, or you hit the maximum in another area the next year. It doesn't matter. You have to take the more restrictive of the calculations. As I mentioned before, there is no Tabor police. DOLA does not track or enforce Tabor limitations, including on the property tax revenue limit in Tabor. But we do have a spreadsheet that can be accessed from our website. Kelly should have access to it. If she doesn't already, I can give you the link to it. But there's a spreadsheet that helps your finance staff do these calculations. And so I'll show that a little bit here more once again when we get into some of those examples. Here's the second of the property tax limits. And as I mentioned before, this is technically a statutory limit, but it is, even though it's statutory, it is a part of Tabor because it plays in relationship to Tabor and the other two property tax limits that Tabor brings up. So all statutory tax levies shall be so reduced as to prohibit the levying of a greater amount of revenue than was levied in the preceding year plus 5.5% plus. Growth increases in assessed value due to new construction, boundary changes, etc. So 5.5% law requires, this is because it is statutory, DOLA is required to track this by communities and enforce when that limit is exceeded. Once again, this is not technically a Tabor limit, but it works in conjunction with Tabor, and so we have to follow it. So that's why it's considered one of the 3 limits on property tax. The way we enforce that is we go through, so every year you submit your budget to us. We actually have a finance team that goes through every budget. They look at all these calculations, and if they notice there's a violation in relationship to this, they will contact all of you, and then they'll work with you on how to correct that issue. Now, the penalty that could be if you all as the city council chose not to correct the issue, then we become limited. We can't grant monies to you. There's publicity associated with it. Your auditor will issue that as a findings in your annual audit. You start to take a black eye. You know, once again, go back to that council 101 training that I did previously, and I always said, think about the headlines in the paper. What do you want in the newspaper? You do not want Cortez City Council violated the 5.5 property tax limitation and kept your taxpayer dollars, right? And those are the type of things you want to be careful with. So, but anyways, I'll show how that property tax revenue. So once again, here's a statutory limitation that your property tax revenue can only increase so much, and you have to balance that out with the assessed value of what's occurring with property values in the community. So here's some of the formula that's used by your finance team, and as I said, some of these examples gets a little technical. They're more geared towards for finance people, but I thought they were a good way to just kind of walk through and start to understand what you have to do. So assessed value, or where you'll see it listed in some of these examples as AV, is determined by the county assessor. They have a whole process that they go through to do that. They have to certify that assessment, that assessed value. I think it's actually done twice a year. They go out and do a reassessment every 2 years, but then twice a year they provide the assessed value to your community. And I'm not even going to go into the calculations and work that the assessors do in relationship to that. But in short, the county assessor provides to the city what the assessed value of the city is.
The assessed value, is that where that percentage comes in? I think it's like 6.9 for residential and 26 for commercial.
Right.
Okay.
So, and Gallagher was a part of that here. So for a lot of years, residential assess rate was limited, and then the burden was put on commercial or undeveloped property. Undeveloped properties are considered commercial too, until they have a house on them. There's limitations on what the residential rate can be. Now, up until 2 years ago, there was only 2 rates, residential, commercial, period. Residential was right around 7%. It fluctuated a little bit each year. That's, that official number actually comes out of DOLA. We have to do these state calculations. We present it to the state legislature. They adopt and approve what the residential assessed value is. And then the burden, the rest of it went on commercial. So roughly, residential was at 7%, commercial was around 23%. So that's a pretty significant jump to residential, or excuse me, commercial with that. Over the last couple of years, especially this last year, and with the removal of Gallagher this last year, there's now, I think there is 5 different rates at the moment. And then in 2 years, there's going to be even 2 more additional rates, if I believe right, and it starts to break down the commercial into a couple different categories. Lodging is kind of bridged out onto its own. Residential is still there, but yeah, that's all the assessors that go into it. And once again, I'm not an assessor, so I'm not going to. I know very, very high level that there are those categories, but that's what the assessor. That's what they do, and then they provide your certified amount to the city, which then Kelly takes and plugs in the numbers into these formulas that we're going to show here. Property tax formula, so it's the assessed value times your mill levy, and that equals the amount of revenue that you will collect. The key thing with any of these formulas, if you know any 2 variables, you can solve the third one. And so here's the property tax limit. Assessed value times mill levy equals revenue. Tabor mill levy limit, though. So you have to figure out what those pieces are. And that's the third property tax limit in the tax rate or the mill levy. Because you could run into, and I'll talk more about this here in just a minute, where you're gaining too much revenue through your mill levy, and so you have to ratchet down your mill levy. And that happens automatically unless you've debruced. And once again, there's communities that have that happen, that your mill levy will ratchet down, but there's also a little tool that could be used to try and offset that a little bit that I'll talk here in a moment.
So that's if like the assessed value jumped suddenly.
Right. So I'll use Uray as an example because we actually went to the, so Uray only debruced from Tabor back in 2015, I think it was. We tried, the community had tried a debrucing ballot question back in the 90s, like 96, 98, and it failed. We tried again in 2006, and it failed again. And then we were able to finally do it in 2014, 15, I can't remember the exact date with that. But in that time period, because of assessed values increasing, our mill levy went from something like 17.5 down to 12 something. And our finance person at the time, every year when we would do budget, before we debruced, every year when we do budget, Kathy would actually present to the city council, if we had debruced at this time, here's how much revenue we would have been able to keep this year. But we have to ratchet down our mill levy because of the Tabor limitation. And so, I mean, and it was significant. On a $4.5 million budget, we were talking $200,000-300,000 annually that we were losing, which really had some impacts with it. So we were eventually, though, and once again, it comes into your role as an elected official as approaching your citizens and explaining to them a tax. Technically, debrucing is not considered a tax increase, but a lot of citizens will tell you it is because as their assessed value goes up, the percentage of tax they're paying on it. The percent number doesn't change, but the dollar amount changes. If my house goes from $100,000 to $200,000 and I'm charged a 10% tax on that, obviously it's going from $1,000 to $2,000, right? Or I guess $10,000 to $20,000 if I do 10%. So you have to go to the voters, but that really puts that burden on you as the elected officials of educating your citizens what you're asking of them and why. And that takes credibility, takes explanation. You can't just say, well, because we need more money. I mean, I don't know about you all, but if you, in an official meeting, try to tell your citizens, we just need more money, so we're going to increase taxes. We're asking, just trust us, vote yes. Of course not. you're not going to do that. You're going to want to be able to go to your voters and say, hey, we need more money, and here's why. Here's the services that we're trying to provide to you that we cannot, and for these reasons. And you have to go through the whole explanation. Well, you're wasting money over here, and you could put it over there. That's part of the process. That's part of local government, and that's just the reality of what we got to do. It's not uncommon. I can give you numerous examples of tax increases that have been approved over the last few years. I can give you examples of ones that failed. The ones that more often pass, though, are the ones where the body did an excellent job of explaining to their citizens, this is what we want to do. We're asking for more of your money so we could provide this service to you because we feel this is of the benefit to you, or we've heard from you, this is what you want. And they go through and make that pitch, and they're successful with that.
So as a debruced taxing entity, we don't have to rebate that money back. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. I'm going to touch on what happens with communities that do have to do that, but you are allowed because you did debruce. And I have not seen your ballot question. Once again, I've seen some communities that debruce one piece of Tabor, but as I said, there's 3 different limits that are out there. Maybe they debruced one of them, but not the other 2. That's happened to some communities. When I work with communities now that haven't debruced and they're working on that, it's not just have your attorney draw up, the ballot language. We put them in touch with attorneys who specialize in this area, and they make sure to cover those things, because I've seen that where there have been communities that they debruced, but they only did a portion of those tax limits, and then they have to go to their voters a second time. And that, as tough as the first time is, Uray took 3 tries. As tough as it is to do it once and get it passed, to try and have to go back again, it would be really difficult. So, with that.
Hey, Patrick, before you move on, Council, just for your reference, in 2020, our mill levy was 1.035 for the city of Cortez.
So a bunch of the information the assessor provides you on their certification evaluation are components of that growth under Tabor and 5.5%. So they, once again, give numbers to Kelly, and then Kelly puts those into spreadsheets and starts to try and calculate that out. So which applies? As I said, there's 3 different ones, and you must harmonize the 3 limits. In essence, you're going to take the one that's the most restrictive. Tabor supersedes conflicting state or local laws. So once again, you can't pass something, you as a body can't pass an ordinance and create a local law that allows you to retain any money on your own in some form or capacity with this. And then even the state legislature has to deal with Tabor. They don't have any type of exemption. Tabor applies to all of us. So the state of Colorado, some of you may have remembered, there's been a couple of elections. The last one that was successful was referendum C back in 2010, 2012, something like that, where the state of Colorado went to the voters and said, please allow us to keep this extra revenue. They tried it again 3 years ago, I think it was, and it failed. And so the state has been actually issuing tax refunds. In fact, what I just read, it's not a lot. I think we're all getting like $7 this next year or something like that. But the state of Colorado is limited by Taylor. So your state government doesn't have exemption to this. The Office OSPB, the Office of State Planning and Budgeting, has to go through and do all these calculations themselves for the state of Colorado.
I have a quick question. So this is an annual thing, like of the 3 limitations, you have to assess which is the most restrictive and apply that to that year?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. In the budget the draft budget that will be presented to you tonight, Drew and Kelly and your staff have gone through and done these calculations already. And so when you see what your projected revenue is for 2022, it's going to be based on the formulas already looked at with this.
On the rebate portion that you were just talking about, like what the state did, how's that calculation done? Is that like you rebate the same amount to every voter? You rebate as a percentage of whatever tax you're rebating, or what?
It's a really good question. Tabor does not dictate how you refund the money. Tabor says you have to refund the money. Communities have done that through different avenues. I know some municipalities that it's hard because you do not have a record of direct tax payments to the city of Ouray by your citizens. We all, as citizens of the state of Colorado, file our annual Colorado tax, right? So the state of Colorado and the Department of Revenue has all of our tax numbers, and so they can sit there and say, okay, you get this amount back. We're going to distribute this back to all of our tax-paying citizens in the state of Colorado. It's not as easy for you as the citizen, for the city of Cortez to do that, because you don't have direct payment. Even property tax that is collected by your property owners goes through the county, and then it's distributed back to all of you. You could sit there and say, all right, we'll give a rebate to all the property owners in our community. But what about all the people in your community that don't own property, that rent? They still contribute. They participate. They pay taxes. Every time they go to the Walmart, they're paying sales tax, which comes back to this. How do you rebate that? So communities have really struggled with that. Sometimes they've tried to look at it through other avenues. They've examined of trying to do it through utility rates. They've tried to do it through waiving of fees for certain services. There's a wide range. There's nothing in Tabor that says how you have to do it. It just says you have to do it. And you have to show, in the end, when you complete your budget for the year, and your auditor will be looking for this, did you rebate the amount that you were supposed to rebate? Now, once again, I'll get into what's called a temporary, I can't remember the term, I'll say it here in just a second. There is a temporary limit that you can try, and I'll talk about that a little bit here, to try and preserve that difference that some communities will use, but in other cases, or like in the state of Colorado's case, they just find it's easier to refund everybody. And the state of Colorado's chosen to do that by refunding everybody who submits a Colorado annual tax report. My younger son has not made enough money to file taxes yet in the state of Colorado. He doesn't get a refund. Yeah, he still goes and buys groceries and all that, but that's just the way the state of Colorado has chosen to do it. So here's an example that we're going to do first, and try to figure out which tax limit applies. And once again, these examples are geared more towards finance people, and you're going to see some numbers flashed up here. You in no way are going to have to try and calculate things. I'm not going to sit there and say, okay, you have 5 minutes to tell me the answer. I'm going to just tell you the answer really quick, right? If Kelly and some of her cohorts were doing this, I would make them try and guess out the answer with it. So Town of Gold Dust is preparing for 2022 budget. The 2021 mill levy for general operations is 9.265. The Tabor property tax revenue limit of $87,997, and the 5.5% property tax revenue limit is $88,188, and the assessed valuation for the Town of Gold Dust is $9.1 million. So this sheet shows the three calculations. So it looks at the revenue limit, looks at the mill levy limit, and looks at the 5.5% limit. And you have three different dollar amounts that are out of this. So in this particular example, the most restrictive, which for this subject with these numbers, is the Tabor mill levy limit. So 9.1 million times the 9.265 comes out at 84,312. That is the amount the Town of Gold Dust is allowed to collect for their revenue for 2022. But what about the next year? So you're looking at that amount that you collected the previous year, and you have the 2023 budget. So the town's finance staff is looking at this again. The mill levy number stayed the same, but now you have the new property tax revenue limit. You have the the 5.5% property tax revenue limit. The assessed value went up from 9.1 million to 9.5 million. And in that particular case, you go through the 3 different calculations, and the revenue limit that year ended up being the higher amount. So that's where it can be a little bit complex. You can't just sit there and say, all right, what is that? I want to see that breakdown. You guys can ask that of Kelly and your finance staff, but once again, we've got a worksheet that we give them. It basically looks like this. In fact, is it still just one page? I was going to say, I remember from when we were doing budget, it was one page. And you just plugged in the numbers, did the calculations, went down the final column on the right, which one was the least amount? That's the number we get to use. Also, a key thing in this particular case, it says the mill levy is 9.176. You can't round that up and say, well, let's just call it 9.2, because once again, you could exceed your revenue collections there. And it's not the official number that your voters have approved. So here's where I was talking to that piece with that. Now, once again, because you've debruced, you don't run into this, but I think it's important to be aware of this because it is a piece that's in there. So as I mentioned with the city of Ouray, for a number of years we hadn't debruced, and our assessed value was increasing. We had to reduce our mill levy. So we had to ratchet, it's called ratcheting down your mill levy. You can do what's called a temporary freeze on that ratchet down to preserve your existing mill levy. It takes a resolution by the town or the city council. We actually even have a form, the DLG 70 certification of tax levies for non-school governments, that a community can use to figure out what the dollar amount is, what their temporary reduction is. You can reflect that. Your auditors will look at that and say, you're good to go with that. This is a tool that is often used by municipalities to preserve that mill levy for maybe a year, or maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. There's no case law that says a municipality can actually do this. Tabor doesn't openly say, oh, you can do this temporary preserving of your existing mill levy. Tabor says you have to ratchet down your mill levy. But nobody's ever tested communities doing this temporary preservation. We did it in Ouray for a few years, and after we saw that it was going to go on, that's when we went to the voters the first time to try and get to debruce, and we were unable to do that successfully, and we had to drop down to the new lever. We eventually had to just ratchet it down. My recommendation when I work with communities, like I said, if you're doing it for 1 year, there's a way you can go about doing it. Nobody's ever tested it in the courts to say you can or cannot do it. It's kind of a accepted practice for municipalities, but if it's something that you're starting to look at to do year after year, you need to go to your voters and ask to debruce instead. So that, I share it out there. It's not something that you as the city of Cortez has to worry about because you have debruced. You get to preserve your mill levy. Your mill levy is not automatically ratcheting down, but I make you aware of it because that just shows how Tabor is, and it's something that's out there, and really, once again, taking it serious into these limitations that are there and the respect of Tabor in the state constitution is, in the end, you're really trying to watch and be responsible with what you're doing with your tax dollars, the tax dollars that you collect from your citizens, and not taking advantage or trying to increase with what you're doing with that. So, as I said before, how do you do that? You can debruce, and this is actually a provision in Tabor. It's in the Constitution about this. It's not officially called debrucing in the thing. So as I mentioned before, the gentleman who created Tabor was named Douglas Bruce, is Douglas Bruce. I think he's still alive. But it's become a term called debrucing with that. It requires an election. You can remove the property tax revenue limit. You can't change your debt increase amounts. And then as it says here, new taxes, policy changes that result in next revenue increases, et cetera. Once again, you can't say, oh, we debruced so we can increase our sales tax, or we can increase our mill levy. That doesn't grant you the ability to increase your tax revenues in any way. You still have to go to the voters no matter what for that. But you can remove some of those limitations, your revenue limitations, your mill levy limitations. You can also limit the waiver. A limit waiver allows retention of revenue in excess of the 5.5%. So you can ask for that 5.5 on a limited basis to be removed as part of debrucing. Now I mentioned before Gallagher. So Gallagher was an amendment that was in place up until, hey Jack, was in place up until last November when the voters of the state of Colorado repealed Gallagher, which quite frankly was a good thing in my opinion, because sometimes Tabor and Gallagher were like this. When Gallagher was actually passed as an amendment to the state statutes before Tabor went into place in '92. And when that happened, sometimes those two different entities butted heads. The movement was made to repeal Gallagher, and there was pros and cons about removing Gallagher. Once again, I'm not here to speak to one side or the other. It was much easier to remove Gallagher than try to make adjustments to the state constitution and change Tabor. As I said before, there will be people that will tell you, in fact, it's not uncommon with government that people badmouth Tabor a lot. In my opinion, not all Tabor's bad. Once again, I personally think, yeah, if you want to do a tax increase, you should have to go to your voters. Tabor says you're required to do that. I just personally think that's good local government practice, right? I will say some of these calculations, though, get a little quirky and difficult and kind of tie our hands when it comes to us as local government leaders and the services we're trying to provide our citizens. So you just have to pay attention to that. What happened, though, is even though Gallagher got removed last year, there were a number of districts, mainly special districts, took the lead on this, especially fire districts. They said, okay, you can debruce and you can remove your limitations on Tabor by going to your voters. Well, they went to the voters to de-Gallagher. And a number of them were very successful in passing that. And it's never been challenged in court of whether they really had the authority to have that done. Because Tabor, as I said before, specifically allowed for voters to choose. That was like a concession of Tabor when they were originally drawing it up, as saying, we want to limit government, but hey, what if the citizens of that community are comfortable with allowing their local government to keep that additional revenue? They should have that choice, that right to say that. So Tabor allowed that. There was no such thing in Gallagher. Now Gallagher's been removed and nobody really knows what's going to happen with that. It's more impactful to county government and especially special districts are really impacted with that piece of there. So anyways, just know that there is that tool out there of debrucing. When you read the CML newsletter, every election in November, you'll usually see a handful of communities that have a debrucing ballot question on there. You know, CML's pretty good about talking about, here's all the ballot questions from the state, you know, the highlights, who's doing marijuana ballot questions, and who's doing sales tax increase questions, and who's doing debrucing. You'll see that in there with that. And for the most part, at this day and age, they've become pretty successful. You know, people, as long as you're not just going to your citizens saying, hey, we want to debruce, we want to keep the revenue, you know, that's not going to fly. But most communities are pretty sophisticated, saying, hey, this is what it is, and they can demonstrate this is lost revenue that's impacted these services we're trying to provide you. We're hearing from you. These are the services you wanted. This is what it's going to cost. We're asking to keep these revenues to help us do those services, type of thing. So once again, this just it goes into another example of Bruce property tax revenue. Note, the equation, the one number, the mill levy doesn't change. In this case, the mill levy limit was removed. That doesn't change. So the assessed value, and remember the town of Gold Dust, the assessed value in 2022 was going to be 9.1 million. In 2023, it went up to 9.5 million. You get to see, because their mill levy doesn't have to change, they're able to see that increase of $4,000 in their revenue. So let me talk a little bit about enterprises and bonding. So as I mentioned before, you have the general fund for the city, but you also have enterprise funds. You have the airport, the rec center, excuse me. You have those enterprise funds. Enterprise, usually when I'm doing a small class, I'll say, somebody give me a definition of an enterprise. I'm not going to do that to you guys. Enterprises are loosely defined as it's a business entity that the city or the municipality runs. So I'm going to use the rec center, okay? You charge a fee for users of the rec center, whether it's a membership or the daily walk-in person. It's a beautiful rec center. I've used it myself, love going there, but you charge a fee to it. The fee is in turn used to operate the place. It's not, oh, we charge the fee and then that goes towards police services or, administrative costs or any of those other type of things. The fees are collected and go towards that. It's a separate fund in your budget, and it's tracked. It has its own revenues, its own expenditures. That's an enterprise fund. Tabor does not apply to business entities or enterprise funds. Once again, water systems, usually water, wastewater are your most common enterprises. The airport's another common enterprise. Rec centers are a common enterprise. Those enterprise funds, the only time, like I said, Tabor does not impact, so your finance staff does not have to do those Tabor calculations regarding to that, but Tabor does keep an eye on enterprises. If at any time you as the city council approve the transfer of tax dollars to an enterprise in excess of 10% of the revenue, annual revenue of that enterprise, you lose the enterprise status for that fund. So why would you do that? Okay, I can give you a couple examples. You have let's say you have a water system, a water utility enterprise fund, but CDPHE sent you notice that your ground source spring is influenced by surface water, and you now have a surface water system, and you have to increase the amount of treatment that you're doing on your water system. It's going to cost you to build a brand new treatment facility for your water system. Okay, you collect an annual fee, or excuse me, monthly bill, utility bill from your citizens to help pay for your O&M, your operating and daily operating and maintenance. You probably have calculated into that fee also a little bit money that we have to put into capital improvements that we have, but constructing a new water treatment facility for a town of 1,000 people, a new water treatment facility is running about $8 million right now. 1,000 people at $8 million pay it. That's a pretty extensive dollar amount, especially if you have to say, crap, we have to do that now. We can't wait 5 years to raise the money. We need to build that now. Oh, but look at this. We've got reserves in the general fund. Let's just transfer that money over to help our water fund. That's where you have to be careful with that. Another real life example I could give is, once again, I'll go back to when in the city of Ouray, when we remodeled the Hot Springs pool, and we were trying to get all the components together. Of course, when they dug up the old pool, we ran into some cost overruns because they uncovered some things that we didn't anticipate that were under the ground because there was no records or data or blueprints of showing what was under there. Ran up the cost of the project. We started to really how are we going to pay for this? One of the things we considered was we had the year before passed a sales tax increase for capital funding. So we went from 3% to 4% sales tax. That 1% sales tax was dedicated to a capital improvement fund within the general fund to pay for capital expenditures. We had a nice healthy amount in that. We considered transferring that to our enterprise fund because the Hot Springs Pool is run like a business, similar to the rec center, right? But we were going to exceed the 10%, and we would lose the enterprise status of that. And so that would then take into all these considerations that we would now have to look at revenue limitations by Tabor. What are we generating in annual revenues? What are our expenditures there? All those calculations that I talked about before, we were going to have to apply to that enterprise or to the Hot Springs Pool. We didn't immediately say, God, no, we're not going to run away from that. We actually looked at that and considered that for quite a while in relationship to what we thought we could do. Now, just because there was the chance that we were going to have to make that transfer for that 1 year and we would exceed that 10% number that Tabor would kick in, we would lose the enterprise status. You can go back to being an enterprise the next year as long as you can demonstrate and show that you're not transferring taxpayer dollars to pay for a service that is fee-based, fee-collected. We looked at that. We found other funding sources. As I mentioned before, we ended up doing the COPs and the way the bonding attorneys were able to work with us and the finance people with the bonding companies were able to do that. We didn't have to do that, but that would be an example where you would do that. We were at least going to make the conscious decision to do that, but sometimes, and I've seen this with other communities, they don't make a conscious decision. They're just thinking, oh God, we got to build this water treatment plant. We've got money here, let's just transfer it over. They transfer it over, and then all of a sudden they get a notice from us when we're reviewing their budget, or their auditor, when their auditor's doing this, is saying, hey, you've exceeded the Tabor 10% limit on this. You lost the enterprise status on that. That's going to impact you next year. So you want to be cautious of that. The other thing has to do with bonding.
Before you get to that, are there Tabor implications if you were to transfer, if things were to go in the other direction? Like a successful enterprise, and then you're transferring into your general fund or into something else?
Absolutely. Let's just say, hypothetically, the rec center has a banner year. Revenues by far exceed expenditures. Yet you're desperate for new police cruisers or something like that. So let's just transfer the money over. That transfer is calculated into your revenue increase for Tabor under your general fund. So yes, it does have impact. Once again, it doesn't mean you can't do it. You know, for years, City of Ouray transferred money out of the Hot Springs Pool enterprise to the general fund to prop up services that we were doing there. For years, the Hot Springs Pool propped that in. But then it went into the calculations with that. And so the idea, and the city councils at the time looked at it as predominantly tourists are the users of the Hot Springs Pool. They're paying for services that we're providing to our citizens, so let the tourists pay for it. So, I mean, you hear that same argument about sales tax, right? You know, especially in resort communities, that we hear that argument all the time. Let the tourists pay for it. Well, they're also the bigger impact on some of your services. They're the ones driving on your roads, using your systems. Police interact more often than not than with, you know, all those type of arguments. You could be there, but you could do that. But it goes into those calculations. The other side is on the bonding piece, though, because once again, bonding is a form of debt that you're taking on. If you're bonding in the general fund, you have to go to the voters. Tabor requires you to go to the voters. If you're bonding an enterprise, technically you do not need to go because it's outside of Tabor. It's an enterprise. Now, politically, you may not want to just do that, but once again, going back to that example with the water treatment facility, you know, you may get a lending institution that's willing to lend you the money, give you a favorable rate. All it takes is action by the city council at a meeting to approve, we're going to enter into debt on this enterprise because it's outside of Tabor. You can technically do that. Once again, though, I would ask you, you may want to look at that politically. We did that with the city of Ouray. We could have bonded the improvements to the hot springs pool by just a vote of the city council. We chose, though, to go to the citizens and have the citizens approve that bonding politically more than anything, because we wanted our community behind the improvements we were making at the hot springs pool. We did that. But that is a difference between enterprises and general fund. Tabor limits that in regards to bonding for your general fund, does not impact that with enterprises. Finally, some other Tabor considerations. And I take this and I'll reference this. So CML has an excellent document about Tabor, but it's 158 pages long. Unless you're Kelly or Drew, you don't want to read it, right? Or you suffer from insomnia that you want to do that. But in the back, they have a thing that's called epilogue, and they talk about 10 important things every municipal official should understand about Tabor. This is how long it is, 2 pages, right? I recommend have your staff maybe get these 2 pages, this epilogue from you, and it gives you, and it goes through 10 things to understand about Tabor. A number of the ones I've already hit on this, mainly in regards to the limitations piece, but there's a couple more that I want to talk about. First off, understanding the differences between taxes and fees. Taxes are what you collect from your citizens, right? Sales tax, property tax. Those are the 2 taxes. I mean, sure, there's a few other, there's use tax and other things that are out there, but the primary ones that we collect in local government are property tax and sales tax, right? Fees, however, you collect fees within the general fund. It's not just fees as part of the enterprise with the rec center, the fee that you pay to go in. In the general fund, you collect building permit fees, development fees. You may collect business license fees, those type of things. Those fees are in there. Fees are calculated into Tabor in your calculations for your budget, but fees are not subject to a vote of the citizens. You all could impose fees by taking action at a city council meeting, period, right? So most common, once again, is building permit fees. Every few years, your staff should be bringing to you, actually, not just building permit fees, they should be bringing to you, here's our fee structure for the city of Cortez. We're asking you to approve making adjustments to that fee increase. And the fees could be everything from tickets that law enforcement issues, like I said, building permit fees, development fees, business license fees, all those type of things. Fees are calculated into that Tabor piece, but they do not require a vote of the people to do that. However, the distinguishing part between taxes and fees is taxes just go for general government operations. Yes, you can sit there and say, hey, we're asking our citizens to increase sales tax so we can create a capital improvement fund, and here's specific things that we want to do from that capital improvement fund. But in essence, they're very general. Fees have to be for a very specific service or delivery of some a delivery of a product back with it. So you have to show the nexus for that fee. So, once again, a building permit fee is usually calculated on the complexity and the square footage of the unit that's the building inspector is looking at, and it's calculating their time, the building inspector's time to review the plans, to actually go to the site, review the inspection, ensure that the contractors are doing everything according to the pieces, but in the end to comply with the safety standards, right? By the building code that's been adopted. That's the idea of the code, is that you can rely on, or a person can rely on a certain level of quality of service that was done on that facility, and the building inspector's costs to ensure that was done. That's the idea behind that fee, right? The fee at the rec center that you charge, the idea is it's a fee that's equivalent to, hey, we charge a fee enough to make sure we can operate our rec center. We're not looking to buy new cars for all the city council members here. we're operating a rec center for our citizens, a quality of life thing. We charge an equivalent fee that we need to operate the facility, right? That's the idea with fees. So you have to be very careful with that, though, because you want to make a nexus of that. And here's something, and Kevin may have mentioned this at the district meeting the other night. At the time of Tabor, certain communities had started to develop what was called a real estate transfer fee. And so, a real estate transfer tax. And so it was a tax, a percentage of tax on all real estate transfers in it. The only one that I'm really familiar in our region that does it, Telluride has a real estate transfer tax. So they had it in place before Tabor was involved. Tabor specifically called out that you could not do real estate transfer taxes unless you already had it, if you were grandfathered in. So Telluride has done that. Telluride makes a lot of money off of their real estate transfer tax. You know, if you, I think it's 3%, right? So a $1 million home, which try and find a $1 million home within the town of Telluride right now, right? But a $1 million home at 3%, that's a nice little bit of revenue for the town of Telluride. Okay. Every time it sells. Every time it sells. So maybe it sold last year for $1 million, and this year it's going to sell for 2.5. They get 3% both times. So, yeah. So, real estate transfer taxes are no longer allowed with Tabor. Some communities, especially resort communities, and with the housing crunch that's occurring right now, have started the idea of discussing a real estate transfer fee. And the fee collected would specifically go towards housing and affordable housing programs. Now, communities are talking about it, but they have to, because I guarantee there's a lot of pro-Tabor people that are watching this very closely, especially because Tabor specifically calls out real estate transfer taxes. People are watching this closely. They're going to have to do a detailed study and show that whatever fee they assign is directly in relation to a service that's being collected to provide something for the community. So we'll see where that goes. But that's once again, that difference between taxes and fees. You got to be very careful. I know I keep using the city of Ouray as an example, but I'll use it here again. City of Ouray does not have a business license of any kind. We debated it every other year for years and years. And one of the questions, well, what do you charge as a business license fee? Well, you have to show what are you doing with that fee. You can't just say, we're going to just charge all of our businesses money. You have to actually show that money that is collected goes towards something. More often than not, communities it goes towards promotion and marketing of the business entities, or to the chamber, or something along those lines, or business retention programs and entrepreneurial programs. A lot of times that's what business license fees are often used for. But you have to show that nexus. So you want to keep that in mind, the difference between taxes and fees, okay? The restrictions on multi-year financial obligations, once again, like I said, you want to be very careful about that. You have to get voter approval to do a multi-year obligation, and there's still a bunch of, it's not just a voter approval, there's a lot of parameters that are in place to really restrict that you can do with that. There are certain ways around that, I mentioned the lease purchase agreements. COPs is a recognized financing source for that, but you want to pay attention there. Limitations on election dates and procedures for fiscal ballot questions. Tabor does not allow you to do a ballot question to your citizens just whenever you feel like it. Because guess what? Once again, some of our resort communities have second homeowners that come for one season. They're going to say, hey, let's do a mill levy increase on property tax, but let's do the election when all those people aren't around, right? When all our second homeowners go home. You can't do that. Tabor, you can only do Tabor during November elections, okay? So you can't do a special election for a Tabor matter. It has to be during the regular election. And also, where it talks about procedures for the fiscal ballot questions, if you haven't already, if you haven't had the experience yet as a city council member, I guarantee you're going to have the experience sometime in the near future when you put a ballot question on the ballot for your citizens, especially if it has any money associated with it. Tabor requires some very specific things to be in the ballot language. Ballot language is already difficult enough to understand often for our voters. Add a financial component to it that's under the Tabor limitations, it gets extremely complex because you have to put in your ballot question what you anticipate to generate. So once again, let's say hypothetically, you all are considering a 1% sales tax increase and going to the voters for that. Your ballot language just can't say, will you approve the city of Cortez to collect an increase, go from 3% to 4%, whatever your tax rate is, for your sales tax. You have to say, with an anticipated annual revenue of X amount of dollars from that. You have to explain that so that the idea with Tabor is, yes, not only do you have to go to your voters for a tax increase, you have to explain to them exactly how much you think you're going to get to it. Now, voters approve it, and you have a banner year the next year, and you exceed that dollar amount, there isn't some type of penalty that's set there. It's more about the education on the forefront for your citizens that you have to do that. Here's another little cool thing about Tabor, or I think it's cool. Not everybody will think it's cool. Some of my counterparts in Denver don't think it's cool, but it's defense against unfunded state mandates. Governor Hickenlooper a few years ago made a big deal. His first executive order when he was first voted into being the governor of the state of Colorado, executive order 1 was there could not be any unfunded state mandates. Well, guess what? Tabor already said that. You all, as the city of Cortez, have a mechanism in Tabor that prevents you for having to pay for unfunded state mandates. So if the state legislature passes some type of law that directly impacts you in some capacity, that pulls money from your citizens to do something for the state as opposed to something that you as the elected officials for your citizens, you can push back on that. The most recent one I could see that with, and there's some nuances with that, but a couple of years ago, the state legislature passed a statute requiring body-worn cameras for law enforcement, right? So the counties are really dealing with it. Sheriff's departments are really dealing with that. This last year, the state legislature had to pass a bill providing a funding source for body-worn cameras. They could not require body-worn cameras without providing some type of funding source to help pay for those. And that's Tabor involved. So to me, that, like I said, that's my opinion, that's a good thing. And then the other big thing with Tabor is it really increases the elected officials' role in controlling municipal finances. It puts that burden on you. Now, your staff obviously is the one doing the work. They're the ones with the sharp pencils and the pads and the calculators, and they're out doing all these things. They've got, I'm willing to bet they've got dozens of spreadsheets that they work through and put all these pieces together. That's excellent. You want that. That's great that you have capable staff to do that. You want to review that with them. But in the end, the responsibility is on you. If you go back to the Council 101 training that I did, your staff presents the budget. You all are the ones that approve the budget. You have that responsibility to your citizens, and Tabor really puts that, and it puts you more in the role of really understanding what's out there and these things. Now, that doesn't mean I expect you tonight when the budget's getting presented to you to be really questioning your staff and saying, show us those spreadsheets. You can, and I'm sure they'd be happy to show them to you, but rely on them that they're doing their due diligence with this. And when you say, hey, what is this here? And if they say it's because of Tabor, we got limitations here, pay attention to that and understand where that background is coming from. And then be able to communicate that to your citizens too, because you will get citizens that say that. Boy, last year was a banner year. We know there were so many more people in town, and sales tax numbers, I'll pick on you, Ray, again. It's been all over the paper. The sales tax, the last 2 summers have been off the charts with the amount of visitors, despite COVID, right? Sales tax, City of Uray, in the last newspaper I just saw, is up 60% over 2019 numbers in sales tax. 60%. That's unheard of. The best year that when I was the city administrator we ever had was 13%. 60% to date this year so far. Now that will change, because we're getting their summer tax numbers. That's our big months and anything. They'll probably finish the year about 20 to 25% up. That's huge amounts. Citizens will go, great, what are you doing with all that money? Well, sometimes you have those limitations in place, and you can't do those things. So you got to be aware of that as elected officials, being able to explain that to your citizens. So, all right, that was a really dry subject that I went through. I want the opportunity to, once again, ask any additional questions or dialogue or things that you want to throw out with that. But that is the quick and dirty on Tabor, trying to break it down into not quite the detail. Your finance staff will understand it. Knowing Drew, that what I do know about Drew and as a fellow city manager, we have a good working knowledge of it, but we rely on our staff to really tell us the details on things, and we can go in and do some of those calculations. You guys, though, are the elected officials. What kind of questions you got?
With the sales tax growth, because that's definitely something we've experienced, does that just qualify as local growth?
That goes into those calculations, yeah.
Thank
So
you.
in essence, very simplicity, a very simple way of explaining it is your staff will sit there and say, okay, here's our anticipated revenue for 2021, right? Sales tax, property tax, fees, all your general fund revenues. Here's your dollar amount. And then that's the number that they start to use to calculate. So yes, sales tax is calculated into that. But the good news is you guys have debruced, so you've kind of removed some of those limits from you. So you don't have, it's not going to have as big an impact on you as it would other communities that haven't removed one or all of those limitations that are there. I'm not anticipating you guys are going to get your budget presented to you tonight, and you're going to be told by your staff you have to do a tax rebate of any kind. What else? Kelly, Drew, anything you guys want to add? I went a little longer than I anticipated. Sorry, guys.
Thank you for making sense of a very complex topic.
I hope
I'm
I
sure
did.
it just scratches the surface, but
I sure hope I did. Once again, my contact information is up there. Always happy to pass it on to you. Your staff has my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you think a question. I mean, we all know this. You're here now, you're not thinking of any questions tonight when you're driving home, or, after the meeting tonight, having a glass of wine, relaxing, all of a sudden you go, wait a minute, what about this? By all means, funnel it to me. I'm happy to follow up with any questions.
The one last thing, can you share your presentation, share your slides
Yeah,
with us by email?
absolutely.
Thank you.
I'll forward that to your staff, and they'll get that to all you guys.
Thanks.
Tonight, maybe I'll do it. Might be tomorrow morning before I do it, but yeah, happy to.
All right, thank you so much, Patrick.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your time.
All right,
Okay,
great
we're
to
gonna
see you.
move to the next item on our agenda, which is just general council discussion. Do we have any discussion? Okay, then we'll adjourn our work session and then start our official meeting at 7:30.